Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Digital Enterprise Society, and this first episode is going to be a little bit of an introduction of who is the Digital Enterprise Society and why does this podcast exist. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the pleasure of serving as the co-host for this brand new and exciting project. With me today on today's episode is my co-host, Craig Brown, who is a retired PLM leader from General Motors, and Nate Hartman. Nate is a professor and department head at Purdue University and is the outgoing chair of PLM World. Welcome both to the podcast.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
So Nate, let's get started. You know, there's been some big changes going on around here. So why has there been this change from PLM World to the Digital Enterprise Society?
The change really was a result of Siemens' change in strategy of wanting to bring their events in-house. And as you know, for a long time, PLM World had historically run the national level and regional level user events for the Siemens PLM user group. And so when Siemens decided to put more resources behind it and to change their strategy for how they wanted to run events and to bring messages to the community, that left PLM World with an opportunity really to change the way we worked as an organization, to change the way we engaged with the community as an organization, and to change what our focus was. For a long time, PLM World had been targeted primarily at running those two different levels of user events underneath kind of the umbrella of promoting professional development within the community. But now that this change has been made, we can take a much more focused view and a much more focused set of strategies and tactics to that particular end.
So you were serving as president when these changes came about for PLM World. What were some of the discussions that the board had as far as how to find a new direction?
Well, a lot of our early discussions centered on how do we continue to engage the user community around that particular set of products. And also, how do we continue to give the user community a voice in the development and future directions that are generally associated with those kinds of technologies? Hardware and software tools that are used in practicing or doing product lifecycle management are generally fairly complex. And while the software community develops what they're able to, and to some degree they develop what they believe their customers need, there's always, I think, a desire for and an opportunity for the user community to have a voice, if at all possible, in that development and in those plans.
So you guys have worked hard over the past, I think, about 10 months trying to set this all up and get this change going. So now that the Digital Enterprise Society has arrived, now that it is the new face of the organization, what is it that you want to accomplish directly? What is the Digital Enterprise Society?
Well, that's an interesting question, Tom. I think one of the primary focal points that kept coming up over and over and over again as we talked through this as a board for PLM World was, how do we continue to bring the users, the customers, the implementers, the integrators of these tools and of these methods together into a place where they can have a dialogue, where they can share stories, where they can learn from each other? That when we were PLM World and when we ran the event, so much of our post-conference survey information and so much of our interaction with the users really pointed towards them communicating with us that they enjoyed and really look forward to the ability to network with each other. Even though they learned a lot from the presentations and roundtable discussions and things of that nature at the conference, it was still the one-on-one or a few interactions that they would have with colleagues and collaborators from around the country or even around the world that it seemed like resonated most with them. And so one of the primary focal points that we've had in our deliberations about what to do with the Digital Enterprise Society, those kinds of things, that collaboration and interaction amongst the user community has been front and center of in the majority of our conversations. And so as we were beginning to craft organizational structure, bylaws, things of that nature for the new Digital Enterprise Society, we were trying to do that with an eye towards how do we continue to enable these people to talk to each other, to collaborate with each other, to learn from each other, in as much as they may have ever learned from the technology community themselves.
So a lot of the old focus, not all of it, but a lot of it was on the large events that are no longer the focus of the new organization. Mm-hmm. So what types of things, what types of platforms will be involved? What types of education will be involved through the new organization?
Again, a really good question, Tom. I think for the vast majority of the history of PLM World, it was a conference-oriented organization. And whether that was the national conference that would happen in the springtime or whether it was the regional user group events that happened in the fall and wintertime, it was always centric on the event. And one of the things we've talked about has been how to meet people where they are. And rather than having as much travel for people to come to events and other things where they have to leave where they are, a lot of what we've been talking about is how do we meet people where they are. And so if and when the Digital Enterprise Society ever gets to running events, what we talked about so far has been events that might be in partnership with other organizations and events that operate within this community, or maybe smaller, sort of micro events, if you will, that might really be smaller, more intimate gatherings of, say, 50 to 100 people rather than thousands. We've talked a lot about how to use online platforms. This podcast series is a good example of how we can bring content to people that doesn't necessarily require them to leave their workplace or leave their home. We've talked a lot about facilitating communication and facilitating networking within the community. And while there's still a lot of benefit to face-to-face interaction, there are increasing number of ways where you can facilitate at least a similar level of interaction online as well.
So this podcast is going to be one of those ways in which people can learn and connect and get inspired. And Craig, we have a lot of ideas and a lot of things planned moving forward. It's going to take some time to grow up. But Craig, what are some of your thoughts about the podcast as sort of one way of helping bring people together and educate them?
Well, what I've found over the years is we all have a lot of the same problems. We just don't realize it until we start comparing notes. One good example, a former board member, John Jarrett, and myself, we got to know each other long before PLM World, and they were a small company compared to a General Motors. But it was interesting. We were very similar in our tool chains, and we were having similar problems. Some of it was organizational, some of it was technology, some of it was just, frankly, overstated expectations of the tool vendors. So I think podcasts, when you find out somebody else is having the same kind of challenge, it might be interested to reach out to those people and find out, well, what did you do? Did you just wait? Did you organize? One of the things we did start a bit more aggressively in PLM World were working subcommittees. So people that have similar interests that chose to get together to talk about how would they proceed. And in many of those cases, Siemens was an active member, which was really great. So I think people need a place, an umbrella, if you will, that they can organize under. Now, we used to always, and I'm sure some of them still are at the event this year, get together after the event. But there's other reasons to get together. And maybe you get together 3 or 4 times a year. It depends on what you're trying to achieve in this group of people. At the end of the day, it's just the way we are, especially here in North America. We self-organize into small groups, we start focusing together, and we solve problems. And the tool vendors, by and large, especially the guys developing tools, they really like this. They like the fact that they're getting mostly a consistent debate to tell them, well, what should the direction be? Especially with big enterprises, a lot of times that message gets confused by the time it gets to the developer, what was really intended, and a place where you could sound out, well, this is what we heard. Did you mean this or did you mean that? That's a good thing for development. So I think figuring out how to do working groups through this modern technology of podcasting. And I recently was working with a group that uses Slack. That's another new one. It's interesting to me. And now that I have a bit of time on my hands, I can pursue some of those. So these are the area. And one other comment to the community, if you're listening carefully, send us your ideas. We can go after any direction. One of the ones that kind of interested me as I was leaving the board a year and a half ago, Professor Hartman pointed out, there's this unmet need in small to mid-sized manufacturing companies where they're not embracing the tools as much as, say, a big General Motors did. And it was interesting of, kind of figuring out, well, what's behind that? I think part of what's driving us for education in the Digital Enterprise Society is it make sure it's not an education issue, but also when you uncover what it is due to, then help organize efforts to resolve that. Cloud computing might well help resolve it because it'll lower the cost of entry, and that would be a good thing for everybody. So this is another angle about, we don't just need the tool guys talking about cloud computing. We need the leaders in each of these companies, small, medium-sized, and large, to talk about it.
And that's one of the things that we've decided that we'll do with this podcast is they won't all be the same. As you listen to the upcoming episodes of this, there will be ones where we'll interview the tool vendors and the people who are doing the research and creating the tools. We'll interview the people from the companies and not just the large companies. That's something that Greg has been very adamant about, is he wants to talk to people from small, medium, and large companies. And then on top of that, we'll sprinkle that in with some career development topics that matter to people who are just trying to manage, their own potential and grow their career. So, Nate, he mentioned the fact that you've done some research on large versus small companies engaging using these tools. Is there anything you'd like to share about that coming from the research that you've done at Purdue?
Sure. It's something that we've encountered a number of different times here in a couple different research projects, but to distill it down into maybe the salient points and takeaways is that much of the transformation that has to happen in a company in order to really embrace these kinds of technologies actually has little to do with the technology in and of itself. It often is a matter of changing the way the organization works, changing the way the organization measures itself, changing the way the organization communicates, both internally and externally, amongst the different actors and the different roles that are part of the organization. And one of the things that we have found is that given how flexible in some cases the architectures for PLM technologies can be, it sometimes gives companies fits, particularly smaller companies, because smaller companies tend to operate rather lean. They don't have a lot of extra personnel or a lot of personnel even to begin with. And so people in smaller companies tend to perform a few different roles. And in doing so, they often don't have the dedicated personnel resources to put on, for example, the implementation of a particular set of tools or of a particular method. And so one of the things that often discourages them that we have found is that they simply don't oftentimes know where to start with the technology. And in many cases, it's not even what proves to be the case is it's not even about starting with the technology as much as it is starting with their culture and starting with their process and practice. And frankly, learning the difference, or at least acknowledging the difference between what is process and what is practice inside an organization. And that in and of itself is often at the very heart of why in some cases these implementations of technologies are successful, or in cases where they're not successful, is whether or not a company can flexibly adapt, I should say, its process and practice to fit this change in culture. We sit sort of at this precipice of transformation with Industry 4.0. And, Industry 4.0 is not a thing. It's a collection of technologies, of methods, of practices, of tools, of environments. And so that's not an easy thing in many cases, both conceptually or operationally, for a person or let alone a company to wrap their collective mind around and form a solution. As people have begun to trace the lineage, if you will, of this thing called Industry 4.0, which is somewhat analogous to this concept of a digital enterprise, especially when you talk about this in a manufacturing context. Although, to be fair, that's not the only context in which a person could talk about these concepts in, although it's the one that's most germane to obviously our audience here. When you think about what most of us, particular age demographic, if you will, learned about in school as the Industrial Revolution, we learned about it as the Industrial Revolution, not a Industrial Revolution. We didn't contemplate the fact that there were going to be more of those kinds of revolutions. We just simply learned that, there was electricity and a steam engine and things like that. And, that led to the mechanization and the efficiency of work. Yet we've gone through mechanization to electrification to automation, and now with Industry 4.0, digitalization. And, I'm sure that there will be an Industry 5.0 as well, or even a 6.0. I don't have a very clear crystal ball these days, so, who knows what that might be. But the reason I bring that up is because what we're facing today is a transformation and a displacement of people and products and technologies that is happening faster than the other three revolutions combined. And so one of the things that the Digital Enterprise Society can do is give people a place to go where they can talk about these topics, where they can learn from each other, where they can hopefully in some way mitigate the pressures and the pace of this particular industrial revolution.
I actually love, go ahead, Craig.
If I can add on, we hosted a workshop of sorts at the last year's conference on disruptive technologies. And the group that helped me organize that, they were from Mentor Graphics. And I thought it would be interesting to have a discussion about why are these disruptions occurring? So Mentor Graphics strategist, a Siemens strategist, myself representing a car company, we held a panel, and what ensued in the discussion was really interesting. There's different forces that are causing transformation. Part of, the title was Disruptive Technologies, and what does it mean to you, right? I thought it would go along the lines of, oh, my job has to change because there's this new thing. I don't have to be a release analyst anymore or a particular kind of engineer. I need to be a more systems engineer, right? Well, that was one of the topics, but a different topic arose that is just tool intercompatibility, right? And so somebody from another large company brought up, that's the real disruption is my job changes because the tools don't deliver what I was expecting, or at least what I was led to believe, or at least what I heard, right? And of course, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But I found it interesting that this pace of disruption is something that's frankly scaring a lot of people. And my interest as I enter full retirement is calming folks down and trying to make it clear, well, yeah, the disruption's coming. Somebody's going to do it, right? You might as well embrace it and learn from it, and also not be too scared of it. But Nate said something earlier about the right measures. What I have found over my career is it's the measures change, and it's aligning up the measures to the technology disruption so the processes can evolve in the right way. When you ask the existing process guardian, is this good enough? You will typically hear the answer no. And that's because they want it the way they've always had it, because that's how they know how to measure it, how to operate it, all that kind of thing. When you come in with a new measure and you say, hey, and there's this other technology that lets you embrace that measure, well, it takes really good leadership to see it and then to encourage the workforce to follow it. And right now in the car business, you can read the news lines every day. There's a continual change going on in the workforce of resizing, right-sizing, focusing on some different products than autonomous vehicles and electrification and so on. That's a disruption of a whole nother nature, right? So I hope the Digital Enterprise Society, we become a safe haven for people to talk about disruption, but not to be scared of it, but rather to embrace it. I mean, that's what leads to personal success, is being able to embrace this disruption and know what to do about it. I think all of us have insights to that. And, some of us embrace change because we This is what we like to do. Other people, they're really scared of it. Well, those of us that embrace it, we need to address those fears. We need to make people aware that it's not that bad. You just got to be willing to learn and go on. And that's why we want to be about learning and education. Right?
I mean, Craig, I'd piggyback on that just a little bit and say that if you look at the literature throughout history, for every industrial revolution we've had a sort of an equal and accompanying educational revolution. And this one is no different. It went from things like masters and apprentices all the way through what, you and I would have known as industrial arts in school, all the way to where we are today, where, I look at my 3 children who are in school right now, one in high school, one in middle school, one in elementary school, and they're learning about things like math and science, but in the context of designing and making. Why? Because the context of designing and making makes these fundamental things like math and science real, not necessarily abstract. And so one of the things that we've been doing here has been working really at both ends of the spectrum, right? Because there is workforce development in the sense that we have to deal with people who are part of the workforce today and have to live through this transformation. But there's also workforce creation, which is what is that next generation of people going to need to know in order to survive in a world that is essentially a digital enterprise, that is going to survive in a world of work that is Industry 4.0 or Industry 5.0 or 6.0 or whatever it is we're up to at that particular point. And so it's one of the things that is, I think, incumbent upon the Digital Enterprise Society as we go forward is to, in as much as we're able to affect and to help this idea of the workforce transformation, we're going to need to think about it in 2 ways: the existing workforce and developing them, as well as the talent pipeline that needs to come through on the backside, if you will, and create that talent pipeline, in the spirit of what is happening from an industrial transformation point of view.
Yeah, and the other thing, there's a third dimension, I think, which is, some of those youngsters that grew up playing games all the time, who have had an iPhone attached to them ever since iPhones were sold, they're expecting a user experience and an interaction with designs of products that a lot of us older folks might say seems nonsensical or even a waste of time. And then all of a sudden they invent stuff you never would have thought possible. And you're like, now wait a minute, they just did something in days that used to take us months or years. And the reason they did it is because of their comfort level with technology. So this third leg is, some of those folks you really don't want to hold back. You certainly don't want to demoralize them, because they're already off and going on how to apply, whether it's their handheld device or whether it's a podcast or all these other interactions. They have no problems talking with somebody halfway around the world, solving a problem. In fact, it's kind of second nature to them, right? So I think that's the other thing I would teach the folks in my generation is keep your eyes open and embrace it, because there are other ideas coming on how to do product development that are not the third industrial revolution. They're, like Nate said, they're the 5th one and the 6th one. They're coming, right? And it's hard to predict. So instead of predicting, it's better to embrace, right? Just realize disruption's coming and embrace it and be comfortable with it. And yes, sometimes that is very disorienting. And so coping mechanisms are how you deal with that. That's a good thing to keep in mind. But I think it's an amazing future. And I think the people, the creators of technology, that's all of us in the community we're talking to, it's a really fun time to be in engineering and in product development and even in the service side of it, right? The connections between data you can collect from the field and what it can do to improve the product, even though it's already in the hands of the customer, it's just pretty amazing. And so, applying that well and taking advantage of each of our skills, but also the disruption that's natural in it, that's the future. That's why we're here.
I think we've covered a lot of ground. And if this first episode is any example, I think people should be tuning in week after week to the Digital Enterprise Society's podcast, because You never know which way it's going to go. We've talked about a lot of things. We talked about the speed of transformation. And the one thing, as I get older, the one thing I've learned is that it doesn't matter what industry you're in. If you're in a technical industry or in a more traditional industry, the only consistency that I've seen in my career over now coming up on 30 years is that change is the only consistent that we have out there. I loved the fact, Nate, that you talked about it's not the industrial revolution that we studied, but that was just a industrial revolution. And we continue now to go through more, and we'll always probably continue to go through that. So I think that there's a lot of things that the Digital Enterprise Society is going to be able to help guide people as we deal with this rocket ship that we're all on. So as we wrap up this episode, any last messages for people who might have found this first episode, who are going to get involved with this new Digital Enterprise Society? Where do you think we're going to take them?
So, Thom, I think a couple things. One is, if you have an interest in seeing or hearing about a particular topic on this particular podcast series, please communicate with us and let us know. You can go to digitalenterprisesociety.org, and you can communicate with the staff and the volunteers of the organization and let them know what you think and how you feel about what the organization is doing or what the community might be interested in. I think, secondly, get involved. There is going to be a series of calls for volunteers that will be coming out throughout the remainder of 2019 and into the early part of 2020 as we begin to flesh out the working committees for the organization around things like content creation and development and sustainment models, and possibly even things that have to do with events and partnerships. So if those sorts of things sound interesting to you and you'd like to volunteer, then again, please reach out to the organization and let us know that. And finally, I would say that we will eventually begin to have online forums and other sorts of dialogue type channels, if you will, for people to interact with. And so please, if you have thoughts, opinions, comments, those sorts of things that you would like to share with the community around whatever the topic may be, don't be afraid to post. Don't be afraid to engage with folks and learn from others. So those would be the last things I would leave you with, Thom.
Awesome. Craig?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. And I also agree with Nate on those 3 points. I would add one last point. If there's a topic that you and your peers are talking about that you want exposed, whether it's a particular speaker or even a discussion about any particular topic, like the one I mentioned earlier on disruptive technologies or disruptions in workforce, right? There's a handful of us that have retired mostly. We're doing a few things like the DES, and we've been chatting about a forum where we could answer your questions, where we could possibly even carry on a bit of a debate for the benefit of the broader audience. So we're looking for those questions or those areas. So not just somebody speaking from their expertise, but maybe more of a debate about, well, how do we proceed with a particular technology, or how do we proceed with issues in organizational change? And I think those of us that have retired, we have some things to point out to you, but we don't know all the answers either, especially as you talk about the evolution of the technology frame. So if you're interested in other topics, debates, discussions, that's what we want to know about. We want to know what you want to hear.
Well, thank you to everybody for tuning in and listening to this episode. I think that this is going to be a fun project. It's going to morph and grow as we go episode to episode. And Craig and I are going to try to bring you a lot of interesting people and a lot of interesting topics as we go through this speed of transformation in the industry. The Digital Enterprise Society is dedicated to the transformation of the manufacturing enterprise workforce. And so hopefully this podcast will be one place where you can stay plugged in. All right, we'll be back next week with more interesting stuff. Thanks for joining in.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org.